Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers here in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. As many of you know, over the weekend, voters in Niedersachsen or Lower Saxony took to the polls. What did this election mean for Niedersachsen and at the federal level? I'm joined today by Claudia Wohlsperger. She's a journalist and a reporter with the Norddeutscher Rundfunk, where she focuses on regional politics and economic issues. She's been with the NDR for over 8 years and also worked as a journalist and editor at ARD. Claudia, herzlich willkommen. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be there.
Well, I'm looking forward to our conversation to sort of unpacking both what happened at the state level, but also whether there's anything that we can read into this at the federal level. We've seen several state elections already this year, and many observers have said that they serve as a bit of a litmus test for the governing coalition in Berlin. And yet the situation in each of the German states is unique and different. And so I thought maybe in our conversation, we could start by talking a little bit about the election results in Lower Saxony and what the prospects are for a new government there. Just over 6 million people in Lower Saxony were able to vote. This is about 76% of all of the residents of the state. And among them, there were, I guess, well over 200,000 young voters who were voting for the very first time in a state election. As we talked about a little bit, election participation was low by German standards. There were only about 60% of those who were eligible to vote who actually turned up at the polls. And undoubtedly in our conversation, we'll talk a little bit about what might have contributed to that level of participation. But the results show a pretty clear victory and some pretty clear losses. It seems as if the Social Democrats, under the leadership of Minister President Stefan Weil, have a strong win, even though they lost nearly 4 percentage points since the last state election in 2017. The Christian Democrats lost traction, and the Free Democrats did not even clear the 5% hurdle, and so they won't be represented at the state level. Can you maybe start by talking a little bit about what contributed to the victory by the Social Democrats?
Of course. In general, I think the most important note is really that I think never before has a regional election been influenced so heavily by the crisis on a more global level, like the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, the war in the Ukraine. And these are all topics that are not regional at all. Like the state level has very little say in how to deal with these crises in the first place. So much of what is going on in people's lives, like the worries they have at the moment, are great. Like this has really been the one topic of the whole election campaign. And I think the win for Stefan Weil, the incumbent state premier, was really one out of comfort. Like people chose the safe option, but also Stefan Weil has been in office for 9 years. So people knew what they were getting into when they vote for him. And he's been having to deal with many crises before, like the refugee crisis in 2015, for example, of course, the pandemic. So he's been known to steer the ship safely, more or less, through these crises. I think this is what people have been opting for, which is probably why he won so much higher than, by the way, the SPD on a federal level is polling much, much lower at the moment. Mm-hmm. They're at 17%. So a win with more than 33% is quite the win. That's mostly Stefan Weil's win.
Yeah, it was, I mean, certainly a strong win with over 33%, even if it is a little bit lower than the nearly 37% in 2017. And I guess, you know, one of the questions I have for you is maybe before we get into the results a little bit more, what the issues were that were on the agenda. You did talk a little bit about the fact that this election was influenced by issues like the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, inflation, issues like that. But of course, the previous government was a grand coalition between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, and the Christian Democrats actually had their worst results in the state in more than 60 years, coming in at just about 28% of the vote. And yet, I would think that if Stefan Weil gets credit for steering the ship, perhaps some of that credit is also shared by the Christian Democratic partners in Lower Saxony, and particularly Bernd Althussmann, who was the vice chancellor, the vice premier and economics minister in the state, who has since resigned his post given the poor showing by the Christian Democrats.
Yeah, actually, the CDU didn't really profit in any way from this situation and from being more or less incumbent themselves, which might be just due to the fact that they had a really hard time to creating a clear profile in the election campaign, because obviously they can't really rally against the government work, which they've been part of. Mm-hmm. So it's been really hard to find topics on their own that they can say, like, this is what we're going to do totally differently than before, because everybody is going to ask, then why didn't you do it? So this has been a great difficulty, I guess. And if we look at the pandemic, for example, most of the ministries in Lower Saxony that were active, that had to find solutions, like, for example, the school ministry was an SPD-led ministry. The health and social help ministry is also SPD ministry. The state premier was SPD. So many of the ministers who were decisive in the pandemic were SPD ministers and not so much CDU ministers. But the pandemic wasn't really a hot topic in this elections. We had a survey where only 1% of the people said that the coronavirus rules or way, how do you say it, Maßnahmen?
Measures.
Yeah,
the corona measures.
Yeah, they really didn't play a large role anymore. So what the CDU did was basically try to make this a litmus test election for the Ampel in Berlin, so the coalition on the federal level of SPD, Greens, and FDP. And they rallied a lot against that, trying to say that they would be like a counterweight to that, but that didn't work out for them very well.
So maybe related to that, because I do want to talk about sort of issues at the federal level as well. This is then quite a loss for the relatively new head of the Christian Democrats at the federal level, Friedrich Merz, who came in wanting to revive the party after the poor results by the Christian Democrats in the last federal election, needing to really add to the profile of the party and sort of strengthen the image of the party. To what degree is the poor showing of the CDU in Lower Saxony also traced back to feelings at the federal level about how the Christian Democrats are doing?
Well, I think what they tried to achieve was showing that they have a claim to power, that they were supposed to have the chancellery in Berlin, for example. And the past two elections in Schleswig-Holstein and North Rhine-Westphalia seemed to prove that, because the CDU won there. But of course, the state premiers there were already incumbent CDU premiers. So I guess this election now really showed that maybe there is no such claim to power at all, and that maybe the seat in the opposition is perhaps exactly where the CDU should be at the moment. But also Friedrich Merz really shifted a little bit in the last couple of weeks, really only rallying against the government, against the measures. Nothing went quickly enough for him. And he it felt a little bit like he was fishing on the right border for voters of the AFD. And that didn't work very well at all, because we could see that many of the voters for the AFD actually used to vote for the CDU. So that backfired completely. And I guess, it's to show perhaps they have to really think about what their position is going to be and how they're going to also on both levels, federal and state, how they're going to be opposition party next to the AFD, but not like really clearly separating them from them.
To what degree was immigration a topic in the election? You did say that Stefan Weil, as minister president, had sort of navigated the migration crisis of 2015, 2016 quite well, that people had confidence in him about that. Of course, we're seeing a whole new wave of migration because of the war in Ukraine. And this has been something that's been turned into a bit of a topic by some, but not by others. I mean, we're seeing a very different acceptance of refugees this time around than we did in 2015, 2016. To what degree was this a topic in the election, and also a topic that helped sort of shape some of these results that we've been talking about?
Yeah, it's a little crazy, but I would say not at all. Like, the refugee crisis was not a topic that played a part very much, because I guess people's worries about their own lives at the moment are just much greater. Like, people really worry about not being able to pay their bills, and also knowing that, it sounds harsh, but knowing who these refugees are and that they actually flee from a war has, like you said, like there's a much greater acceptance to welcome these refugees. And even the AFD leader, excuse me, even the AFD leader here in Niedersachsen said after the elections that, of course, these are war refugees, of course we're taking them in. So the acceptance is quite different. And while we now after the election, now that the whole circus is over again, we see that there's actually quite the struggle also to find enough housing for the refugees. We're waiting for a lot more. Alone, Lower Saxony is expecting 70,000 more refugees in the next 5 months. So this is a really big issue for the new government, but it didn't play a role in the election campaign very much.
We've touched on the AFD, and I'd like to come back to them a little bit later. But before we do, I'd like to maybe talk about some of the other parties, because, you know, in addition to the CDU losing traction, the Liberal Free Democrats were the other real loser in this election. As I mentioned at the outset, they didn't even pass the 5% hurdle. They were at nearly 8% in 2017, and I think this is the first time since 1998 that they're not represented in the state government in Lower Saxony. How do you explain this loss by the Free Democrats?
I actually feel like this is very much the influence of the atmosphere on the federal level, and the satisfaction, or rather dissatisfaction, of people with the federal government and the way, mainly how they navigate through the crisis at the moment. The government hesitated really long and didn't really find a good way to deal with rising energy prices for the people. And actually, the FDP was mostly the party that contributed to the feeling like of blocking action and of sticking so much to their own ideology that measures weren't taken. So I think all of the three parties could have turned out better if that hadn't been the case in the last couple of weeks and months. But for the FDP, which is a relatively small party in Lower Saxony anyways, they were at 7% in the last elections. So yeah, that really pushed them over the edge. And it's quite sad, to be honest, because we had a couple of really smart FDP politicians, really pragmatic, really involved, and yeah, now they're emptying out the offices. I was at the Landtag yesterday and seeing them say goodbye and like packing their boxes. It was quite sad, especially also knowing that the right-wing politicians are moving into these same offices. It's going to be quite a change.
It is going to be a change. I mean, as it is, I think the government will have somewhat different contours. As we talked about a little bit earlier, the previous government was a grand coalition between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. The Greens did quite well in this election, going from 8.7% to over 14% of the vote. And so it looks likely that even though they'll have a smaller margin, the Social Democrats and the Greens will team up for a red-green government. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how the Greens fared and what might have contributed to their success, but also more importantly, how might a red-green government be different from the grand coalition that just existed?
If we start with the first question, I think for one, what you also have to see is that in the last elections, 2017, there was a little bit of a scandal around the election. So the Greens had lost one seat to the CDU, which caused the majority to break. That's why there had to be elections. But that also meant that the Greens fared relatively bad in those elections. So back in 2013, they already had 13%, for example. So now we're back on that level, more or less. But also the Greens are just very much on the rise. We have a very popular foreign minister with Baerbock. We have a very popular minister for economics and energy, Robert Habeck, who are both Greens. And also, if we look at the other states, the other federal states, you can see that only 4 regional governments are governed without the Greens by now. So you can really see that like, caring for the environment or like climate change, like, this topic is finally arriving in governance. So this is probably helping, and really the satisfaction with Baerbock and Habeck gave the Greens a real surge. Like back in summer, we actually expected the Greens to turn out with more than 20% in the regional elections. But then the hesitation started, the prices started to rise, and yeah, the federal government didn't really respond quickly enough or unified enough. And like I said, all the parties basically fell back a little bit or lost a little bit of support. But for the Greens, obviously, it still turned out very well.
So what do you think this means in terms of what the new government might be like and how it might be different from the previous government?
I think it's going to be very, very different for one main reason, is that these two parties actually like each other. Of course, here on the state level, you always have politicians that know each other for so long, like they've been working together for so long. And really, SPD and Greens both never really hid the fact that they have great sympathies for each other. And SPD and CDU, on the other hand, have traditionally been in very different camps in Lower Saxony. And they've always made clear that their coalition was born out of necessity and not love. So this is really I think this is really gonna change, because you could see actually SPD and CDU work together quite well. Like they've done a pretty good job, like navigating the crisis, administrating the state, but not so much shaping it, or like they didn't have like a big overarching idea, like how they want the state to look. And I think this is going to be different with SPD and Greens. And like previously, the SPD has always complained that the CDU is blocking investment, is blocking innovation, because they were so adamant on keeping the debt limit intact. And SPD and Greens, for example, agree more on the fact that you might have to make debt in order to invest and innovate the country. So I think that's going to be quite a shift. And also the Greens have made big promises, like advancing the production of renewable energies, for example. And so they're going to really try to push forward on that. So I think it's going to be quite dynamic. I hope it's going to be dynamic, because frankly, the last 5 years have been a little bit dull sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, one of the, I think, things that will bring some excitement in, you've already touched on the fact that the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, has won more seats, and I think that we have to talk about this party. It's often considered to be a party that's sort of limited to the eastern states, but as we can see with this jump from 6% to nearly 11%, it's a party that needs to be taken seriously in the West as well. The other party, of course, on the periphery, on the left party, dropped in support. It was below the 5% hurdle, and is now below 3% of the vote. But there's definitely something happening on the periphery, and so I'd be interested in sort of your take on where the AfD got its votes. Some of them obviously came from the Christian Democrats, but is it possible that some of them came from the Social Democrats as well? Is this a protest vote, or is there something else going on when you analyze the AfD in Lower Saxony?
I think it's quite interesting. Like the results for the AfD, I think, really show how little these elections were about regional politics. Mm-hmm. It was mainly a protest vote. Like the AfD really campaigned against the others. That was their main claim. Like there's an alternative for whatever everybody else wanted. But frankly, also with much too easy solutions. Like, for example, the AfD on a federal level suggests lifting all sanctions against Russia and going back to Russian gas for cheap energy, which obviously is not really an option. So the AfD has really profited, as they did 2015, actually, from the crisis and from people's worries. And this time, obviously, it's from people's worries about, not being able to pay their bills or not being able to heat their houses. And yeah, you could see in voter migration, I actually don't have the numbers for the SPD, but you could see that there was quite the movement from the moderate parties to the AfD, but also from non-voters. And you could also see that, for example, the CDU, many people who didn't vote the CDU anymore, they didn't go voting at all. Obviously, the low voting turnout also shows how maybe unimportant these elections felt for many people, sadly. But the AfD in the last parliamentary term, they've been a mess, really. They've had so many internal quarrels. They actually had the parliamentary group splintered, essentially, because people left the party because they couldn't stand it anymore. So that means that they lost money, they lost personnel, they lost the right to speak the same amount as the other opposition parties in parliament. So that's what might be very interesting in the next terms. Like, they really know what's at stake and they're really gonna use it. But at the same time, they're still the same populist party they used to be. Like, when we asked them what their main topic is going to be, what they want to focus on, they said whatever is worrying people most. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting.
So Claudia, how seriously are others taking this jump in support for the AfD? I mean, I would imagine that it is sort of a warning signal to the other more centrist parties, and particularly to the Christian Democrats, but across the board to the more centrist parties, that one needs to be careful about what's going on the right periphery, but also to a degree on the left as well. So is this an issue of concern?
I think it is for many people. Like when we look at the Monday after the elections, the state level general secretary of the FDP, for example, like he really warned his own party of not jumping to any rash conclusions. For example, the FDP could have said, okay, this is the third state elections that we lost since we're in government on the federal level. We're leaving, we're out. And he really said, don't do that. That would be crazy at this point, because it would cause a government crisis. And he said literally that this is exactly what the right-wing populists want, and this is exactly what Putin wants. So there was great tension in Berlin yesterday or on Monday. What is going to happen with the government? How is there going to be a shift? What is the FDP going to do in the government? Like, how stable is the federal government? And both SPD and Greens on a federal level really, I'm going to say, try to comfort the FDP to say, like, let's steer through this together, because everybody knows what's at stake at this point in time. And the same here in Lower Saxony. The election winner, Stefan Weil, he said, like, he looked at voter migration as well, and he feels most of it was a protest vote against arguments among the other parties or decisions on a federal level that aren't explained well enough. And he hopes, or he was convinced, that with good politics and explaining decisions well, that he can win people back. But we'll see. But also the experience, at least of 2015, showed that once the crisis receded and life got back to normal, that the support for the AfD also went back down. But I'm not sure if that's an automatism.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'd like to remind our viewers that if you have a question, you can submit it using the Q&A function, and I'm happy to fold some of those questions into the conversation. Claudia, we've been sort of toggling back and forth between the state level and the federal level a little bit, and I'd like to come back to the state level. I'm guessing that Olaf Scholz sort of breathed a huge sign of relief, because a loss in Niedersachsen would have been bad for him, bad for his party, possibly bad for his government. And so the fact that the SPD did quite well, that Stefan Weil is supported as premier in the state, and also that a new government can form there between the Social Democrats and the Greens is probably all very positive. But as you sort of think about some of the downsides, like the fact that the Free Democrats did not do well, are there new challenges for Scholz at the federal level that we can sort of read into because of the results of this election?
I think mainly, like you said, in terms of the liberals, the FDP, I think that's going to be the main thing, because back when the federal government formed itself, like everybody thought, like the Greens and the FDP, they were going to be like the teaming up against the SPD, more or less,
right,
to form like a small coalition within the coalition, and that clearly didn't happen now. And I think that's going to be the big challenge, is like to keep the FDP inside the government and make sure, and that's the big difficulty, right? To make sure that you have one government that speaks for the entire government, but then the FDP also feels like they have to stay true to themselves against the left-wing Greens and SPD. So I think that's actually going to be the greatest challenge for Scholz. But I agree that he was probably very relieved. Also, like in the Council of State Premiers, obviously Weil has an important standing now, and he's just going to be an important figure. And he also made clear right from Sunday night that he's going to work, or he wants to work closely with the federal government, like to steer through the crisis. So that's something also that wasn't really possible with the CDU, because obviously the CDU was or is in the opposition on the federal level. But now you have, it's kind of like the balance of power is restored again, in the sense that the state and federal levels are evenly distributed, because in the past couple of months in parliament, it was really difficult, because you had like the opposition parties on the one hand in the state, where the government parties on the federal level, and then you had the CDU being in the government here, but in the opposition there. So I think for those two levels, and especially for the SPD, it's going to be much easier again now.
I mean, I think that this gives the Social Democrats some Rückenwind, right? A tailwind of support, and I guess it creates new Stolpersteine or stumbling blocks for the Free Democrats. And so I guess one of the other questions I have for you is, and you started to talk about this a little bit earlier, but what might this mean in terms of cooperation between the Free Democrats with the coalition partners at the federal level, the Social Democrats and the Greens? You said that initially after the election at the federal level, there were sort of reassurances to the Free Democrats, but obviously the Free Democrats are the smallest party in the governing coalition. Does this weaken them? Does it weaken Christian Lindner, the head of the Free Democrats?
I think it does in some respects, and Christian Lindner yesterday tried really hard to say it weakened the entire coalition, but really it probably weakened the FDP more than the others. I'm not sure exactly. I think we will really have to see what conclusions the FDP draws from this result. There's basically two options. Either, and this was like the first reaction of the FDP after the result, was saying like, oh, we have to sharpen our profile. We have to be clear about what separates us and what's different about us than from the others. But then there's the other school of thinking says stability is more important right now. It's more important that the government has one clear line. So I guess now the question is what it's going to be. At least yesterday, Lindner made really clear again that he's going to stay on his standpoint in terms of nuclear power plants, which is one of the biggest fault lines really in the government, because Lindner wants to keep all three currently running plants running over the next year, and also start a couple of others, while the Greens have already kind of overthrown their own ideology to say like, okay, we can leave two on the net for safety, but that doesn't seem to be enough. And now the question is like, how adamant are they going to be about these positions, and where are they going to just show that they're willing to work together? I think that's going to be the big challenge.
And I guess one last question related to this is regarding the largest opposition party, the Christian Democrats. We've talked about them a little bit, sort of their need to redefine themselves and get back on track. Obviously, these election results are not helpful in that process. If anything, it's an indicator that the Christian Democrats are sort of losing some traction. What do you think the next steps forward are for the Christian Democrats at the federal level?
I really can't say. I think it's going to take a while to process really what happened and what the reasons were. And then, I think we'll have to wait, or at least I can't say at the moment.
So also, as we think about the future, one of our viewers is curious whether the state election results in Lower Saxony, but also the ones earlier this year, can serve as a sort of indicator for some of the state elections that are slated for Next year, Bremen goes to the polls in May, and Bavaria and Hessen have elections slated for the fall. But it might also be just too early to tell what sort of an impact these state elections this year might have on those elections, given, as you say, how much this election was influenced by developments on the national level and not just on the state level.
Exactly. I think that's the main point. Like the influence of national topics or global topics was so heavy, like in these elections, that it's really hard to even say like what the situation is going to be like next year. And I think that's going to heavily impact these election results as well, since there's no real sign of the crisis like receding anytime soon. That probably might still be the case then. And then, of course, especially Bavaria is a very different state from Lower Saxony. So I think, I think it really is too early to tell because of all the tectonic shiftings that are happening all around us. And it might also be as simple as like, how well do we go through the winter? Like, are we going to have enough energy to heat our houses? Is there going to be a blackout? It's very unlikely, but you know, this is something that people fear, and I guess we'll have to see how it plays out before we can look at the next elections.
I do think that the coming winter is going to be very telling on multiple levels. We've talked a little bit about the impact of the war in Ukraine on German politics. Up to now, there has been strong support for supporting Ukraine in the German public. Over 70% consistently are in favor of supporting Ukraine in polls. It's going to be interesting to see whether that support wanes as temperatures go down and heating prices continue to go up, and whether the response by the government is adequate. We had a discussion earlier this week where one of the speakers said, this is the last winter that Russia can hold Germany and Europe hostage with energy prices, and that next winter should be much easier. I think that's true, but it also depends a lot on what does the government do to make sure that next winter is easier, and whether it has the adequate supply and infrastructure to deal with those challenges. So I think you're absolutely right that it's too early to know exactly what next year's elections will look like, but undoubtedly next year will be very interesting politically as well.
If I can jump in there, because I think actually this point is quite interesting. We did a long interview with Stefan Weil in the summer, and he kind of told us his time plan, because obviously Lower Saxony with its coastal line is a key player in like, creating or generating enough renewable energies, or importing LNG, importing green hydrogen in the future, to reduce our dependence from Russian gas. And he really said, like, okay, first of all, one thing on the site is very important that the gas storages that we have are already quite well filled, but kind of depends on how cold the winter is going to be, how much do we have to heat our houses, or how much can we save as a starting point for next year. But then the Lower Saxony position is really to get enough LNG for next winter, and then starting next year expand so much on renewable energies to actually get out of that dependency. So this is one of the key points that the next state government here is also going to be measured on, is how quickly they can muster up that infrastructure and make that happen. And the conditions are quite well. We have a lot of space out on the open ocean. We have a lot of wind. We have a lot of space for wind turbines. But as of now, it takes forever to build one of these wind turbines. So this is going to be really one of the key projects that the new government here has to tackle.
Mm-hmm. So related to that, we have a question from one of our viewers about nuclear power and how the public in Lower Saxony views the extension of the 3 nuclear power plants, at least until April of next year, possibly a little bit longer than that, given concerns over the climate and the environment, as well as support for the Greens. Where sort of does the public come down on this?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because it's changed quite a lot since the beginning of the war. Lower Saxony, especially the Greens here, have always been very adamant. They come from a very strong anti-nuclear tradition. But by now, the last survey we did on that, I think 2/3 of the people in Lower Saxony were actually pro extending nuclear power. Not forever, but at least for a little while, just for security. So that's quite the shift. And even among the Greens, almost half were in favor, or not among the Greens, but for people who vote for the Greens, almost half were in favor of extending nuclear power. But the thing is, with the plant here in Lower Saxony, that technically the plant can't run any longer than December, because the fuel element is burned up. So you would actually have to buy new ones, and that would mean running the plant for another 3, 4, 5 years. So that's quite the extension, and that's also part of the reason why the stress test on the national level kind of suggested only letting the other 2 in southern Germany on the net, especially also because we here have a relatively good supply of renewable energies, and we don't need it as much as the states in the south. Right.
So finally, let me ask you a different question that's come in from another one of our viewers, that's also related to infrastructure, if you will. To what degree are voters and is the public concerned about infrastructure weaknesses, particularly in light of the sabotage on the Deutsche Bahn, which impacted people throughout northern Germany and impacted Lower Saxony in particular? Have issues like that had an impact on sort of the political mood?
I think it just played into like the general nervosity about everything. And this particular case, that's why I've been smiling, because I think it's so interesting how little impact that really had, because the Deutsche Bahn is, obviously that's a prejudice, but the Deutsche Bahn is so known for not being punctual, or something going wrong, or a strike. It's sort of conventional wisdom that if you want to take a train ride, it's always a bit of luck involved. And when that sabotage thing happened, obviously we didn't know it was sabotage at first, and everybody was actually quite relaxed, because everybody just felt like, oh, well, it's the Deutsche Bahn. Yeah. So interestingly, if that was supposed to increase insecurity among the population, that didn't really work very well. Might of course be different once it comes out like who actually did it. As if that turns out to be, I don't know, a terrorist group or Russian intelligence, whatever is possible, that might shift again. But for the immediately reaction, I thought it was really interesting that people were very just, yeah, well, it's the Deutsche Bahn.
That makes a lot of sense, that the confidence in Deutsche Bahn is so low that people just sort of took it in stride. But I think you're right, as the investigation continues and as we find out more about who actually did this, because it most certainly was a deliberate attack, given the technical expertise that was involved in making it happen. that might lead to a whole new set of concerns.
I think so, yeah. But
well, yeah.
Speaking of infrastructure, just today we learned that the new LNG terminals in Wilhelmshaven up on the coast that are now being set up like in a really big hurry, that they're upping police protection of that. So on a governing level, I think the awareness to protect infrastructure has grown with that incident.
Yeah. I mean, and that makes sense. And I think, for all of us following the explosions of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, and now this attack on the Deutsche Bahn, it becomes even more important to really protect infrastructure and all forms of infrastructure, because otherwise that can show a huge weakness as well at a time when there's not enough energy to begin with, when there are other concerns and just so much uncertainty. So I think you're right that will lead to greater security measures all around. Well, Claudia, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us today. This has been really an interesting conversation and very helpful in terms of unpacking what's going on at the state level, but also the implications of that at the federal level. And so I want to thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun. Like I said before, I usually don't do this in English, but it was a lot of fun wrapping my head around it in a different language.
Well, good. I'm glad it was a good exercise for you, and it was certainly very informative for our viewers. So herzlichen Dank.
Thank you.